As minority staff for not more than 30 minutes of questions, maybe 31 since we went over here. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Daszak, thank you for coming in today. I think maybe I'll just pick up right where the majority left off. That Lancet letter, we've talked about it a few times today. I'll read just one more time that very same sentence. Standing together to condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. So you talked about snakes and you talked about HIV. I don't see either of those words in that sentence or in the letter. Why is that?
Because there's a word limit on letters to Lancet. They're not going to allow you to just bang on for a long period of time. Look, at the time we submitted...
If I could follow up on that.
Well, let me follow up first, please. At the time we submitted that letter, the prevailing theories, other than this came from a bat through a zoonotic spillover, were HIV inserts, bioengineered, I think snake DNA, and a bioengineered bioweapon virus. All of those are conspiracy theories. The intelligence agency stated that clearly at the beginning of their report, that there is no evidence to support that. There never was, and there still isn't.
That's helpful, thank you. And so I just kind of want to hone in on the exact nature of what you're saying. I think it's that the word limit wouldn't allow you to fit in the word snake.
Well, the word snake wouldn't be enough to make any difference to that. So it would have to say, for instance, for example, the theories about the virus having snake DNA, or that it's got HIV inserts, or that it's a bioengineered virus. Perhaps they were in earlier drafts of the statement, but they're not in that one.
All right, well,
and they were the only prevailing theories, other than it came from a zoonotic spillover.
Sure. So
which is still the prevailing theory.
Well, let me finish. As a reader and writer of the English language, how do you think the sentence "COVID-19 does not have a natural origin" reads?
COVID-19
does not have a natural origin. Do you read that sentence as being limited to snakes and HIV?
Is that what we said?
Yeah.
Can you read out the context of that, please? I'm not sure what you mean.
That's no problem. We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin.
Yeah, that's what we said then, and we stand by it. At the time, that was the right thing to say.
Do you read that sentence as being limited to snakes and HIV?
I read that sentence February 2020 as focusing on those conspiracies that were out there, and they were the ones that were out there.
It's not quite the question. As a reader of the sentence, how do you read it?
Well, first of all, you would have to go back in time to 2020, put yourself in the mindset of what was going on back then, which were those prevailing theories: bioengineered virus, snake DNA, and HIV inserts. Preposterous, conspiratorial, and without any evidence whatsoever.
Yeah, I just don't think any reasonable reader of that sentence is going to read it that way.
Well, the editor of Lancet read it and approved it. 26 of the leading public health authorities in the world read it and agreed with it. 20,000 plus people signed on to that letter on a public statement. Everybody seemed to read it and understand exactly what it meant, and it was correct at the time, and we stand by it.
You talked a little bit about the diffuse application and BMBL, and you've talked several times about how the BMBL, either says BSL-2 is appropriate, or we've heard elsewhere maybe it doesn't actually have a specific requirement at all. I think the thing I want to focus on is your testimony to us in November wasn't just about BMBL. You told us that you ensured that WIV adhered to the same biosafety levels that were used in the U.S. and that were required by the BMBL. And those are two different things. Ralph Barrett clearly told you that what is used in the U.S. is BSL-3. And you knew that that was not the case in Wuhan.
Well, Ralph Barrett's entitled to his opinion about best practices, which is what he was trying to say in that statement. But I have here the language from BMBL.
Sorry, just because we've heard it
right there.
Yeah, we've heard it 3 or 4 times. As I said, that's not quite the same thing as what do scientists actually do in the United States.
Well, it is actually, because they're the rules that govern what scientists actually do.
So if I follow it, is it that you disagree with Dr. Barrick and you don't actually think that it's common in the United States to use BSL-3 for this type of work?
Ralph Barrick may use it for some types of work. He may go above and beyond the BMBL levels. Good for him, and that's good for us too.
Do you understand him to be an outlier in that respect?
There is no outlier if the rules state something differently. And I want to just add, in the diffuse proposal, we did not propose to use BSL-2 for infection experiments with recombinant viruses. We proposed BSL-3, it's right there in black and white, at Ralph Barrick's lab, using his high standards, higher than the BMBL requires.
Yeah, I think the concern is more that you point to the BMBL, and I understand that.
But I thought your job was to oversee this line of research, and these are the rules that oversee them.
If your collaborator comes to you and says, what we do here in the United States is use a certain level of biosafety, and that's not what they do in China, and people in the U.S. will freak out, I think that distinction is probably pretty important for somebody in your position.
Well, I agreed with Dr. Barrick, which is why the BSL-3 is in the proposal, not BSL-2.
The Year 5 report has been talked about a few times as well. You said something that I just wanted to follow up on. You said something to the effect of, look, there's a record that I tried to submit that report, and that we as a subcommittee have that record. I think what you're referring to, which we do have, and which is not quite what you say it is a screenshot that your folks initiated the Year 5 report on July 24th of that year. And we agree, we have that. We're all
From the NIH system.
Yeah, we're all on the same page there. The problem is routing the report, submitting the report is 2 years later. There's no evidence that you submitted the report in 2019.
Correct. There's no evidence.
That's not quite what you said about an hour and a half ago, and I think it's those types of little misrepresentations.
What did I say an hour and a half ago?
You told us that there was documentary evidence that you had submitted the report in 2019.
What I have here is a timeline with documentary evidence of attempts to submit the report. To open up the system, we had a draft of a report back in June. We tried to get it in the system and it locked us out. I have the record here. We'll send any other evidence that you don't yet have, we will send to the committee.
Well, I'll distinguish. For a starting point, I think we have what you're talking about, and we went over it in November.
Well, we'll find out. I'll check. It might be some that you don't have yet.
I think it's safe to speak for both sides here to say that if we don't have what you're talking about, then at this point, that's a pretty big problem as well.
What do you mean?
If you have extra documents on the Year 5 issue that you have not handled.
I'm talking about we've reviewed all of our systems to try and find information to see if we've got any evidence at all that that report was uploaded, which we know it was. We know we had an inability to get through to the system. It locked us out. And I'm looking for evidence. We may have some here that you don't yet have. We will find it and send it to you.
Okay, I just want to be really clear that the documentary evidence we do have that I think you might be talking about shows that you all opened up the system.
I know that. Yeah, I have that written
Does
down.
not show that you submitted or attempted to submit the report.
Well, I'm telling you here, under oath, that we did.
Okay. I'd like to pivot to some of the more science-heavy aspects of really what we've already talked about back in November. Probably starting with, you had this detailed back and forth with NIAID in the summer of 2016 on the question of whether or not the work you were proposing was affected by the 2014 federal pause on gain-of-function work. So NIAID ultimately decided that your work was not affected by that pause. You've said that several times here today. I don't think we have a problem with that decision. I have not heard the majority have a problem with that decision. So it's not the decision that is in dispute. But I do think we're interested in and would like to focus on some of the arguments you made to NIAID, because their reasoning, I think, was slightly different from what you were suggesting. So I just kind of want to walk through how you...
Well, I just want to correct one thing. This wasn't
Wait.
This wasn't a
Dr.
detailed back and forth.
Dr. Daszak, I let you finish, and I was happy to. I asked that you do the same. So those arguments sort of ran in order, and I'd like to touch on them and talk about them.
Yeah.
The first one, I think, was pretty easy. It was making the point that the 2014 policy should be viewed as applying to SARS, because that's what it says, SARS, but not to the SARS-like viruses that you were planning on working with. I think we understand that argument and acknowledge that the pause was a little bit unclear from a textual point of view there, so I really don't have too many questions about that. You then pivoted, though, to talk about WIV1, which I think is that virus that you all were planning to use as a backbone in your experiments. And you said to NIAID that WIV1, quote, has never been demonstrated to infect humans or cause human disease. Later in the letter, for other reasons, you included a parenthetical to an article that's called WIV1 is poised for human emergence. And that article concludes that, quote, the results indicate that WIV1 has the ability to directly infect humans. I think it's really hard for us as readers to understand how that context was not addressed in your letter.
Both can be correct. It is correct that it has never infected people, to our knowledge. And it's also correct that it infects human cells in the lab, not people. There's no evidence of that. Now, we cite that paper in the response to NIH. NIH is the body that oversees this. If NIH had said, wait a minute, this paper that you cite yourselves suggests that we need to rethink, we would have not gone ahead with the experiment. Don't forget we proposed alternatives to this work. We've sent them a paragraph of modeling studies we could do, pseudovirus work we could do if they decided that the work should not go ahead. NIH had every possibility, every reason to go through that and say no if they wanted to, and we would have not done that work. This is something to ask NIH, not EcoHealth Alliance. We did our best shot at trying to explain why we believe the work was not covered by the gain of function, as they asked us, what alternatives we could do, and then it's NIH that makes a decision on that.
Yeah, so you cited the article for a different reason. You would have had to open the article and read it to appreciate what I just quoted from it. And I understand that I think you're drawing a distinction between human cells in a lab and a human receptor in a lab. So I think the eventual conclusion of that is it does not count until a live human walks in and drops to the ground sick?
No, until it infects a person. There's a big difference between infecting a cell in a lab. And also, you point out that you would have to open the paper and read it. Surely the NIH system that deliberates on these issues actually opens the papers and reads them, as do scientists. I mean, we assume that is this group is doing. They know the literature. They're going to make a knowledgeable decision based on their knowledge of literature, which we cited in our letter to them.
Yeah, so the concern is less on the back end of the reader of your letter, because we do assume that those folks are knowledgeable and they'll open the article. The concern is more on the front end as a grantee, that article's out there and you didn't say anything about its conclusion.
We cited it.
You cited it for a different reason, which
we
we'll come
listed
to.
the paper in our
Yes.
letter to NIH.
Yes, you did. You managed not to include the title of that paper in your email, I noticed.
Well, if the citation's there, the title will be there. If not, they can look it up on the web. But it's a well-known paper at the time from the group that were already doing similar work. They knew about it. Surely they funded it, actually. Surely they knew about that work.
If the paper's results were true, that WIV1, quote, has the ability to directly infect humans, would that be a problem for your argument that WIV1 has never been demonstrated to infect humans?
If WIV1 had been demonstrated to infect people, then that argument that I made would not be true, so that would be a problem. It had not, therefore it was not.
Don't worry about the human cells.
Human cells are not humans. They're cells in a lab. It's a very different thing. Any biologist will tell you that. Same as mice are different to humans. You know, you step up from the cell line work to the mouse work to, then we know from other work that people do in primates and the rest of it. It's a big gap between a virus that can infect a cell in a lab and one that can actually infect people in the wild.
So the progression from there went to, well, because WIV1 is about 10% distant from SARS, and the spikes that we want to insert are getting progressively more distant from there, it seems progressively less likely that any of these chimeric viruses would be more pathogenic, more transmissible. We talked about this in November. You helpfully explained to us that the theory was, okay, we know that SARS-1 is a human pathogen. We know of 95 or 97% SARS-like viruses that simply are not able to infect humans. And so it seems reasonable to hypothesize that as you move away from SARS, you have reduced human pathogenicity. I think what we struggle with a little bit is, at the time, if you know that SARS-1 is a human pathogen, and you know that a 95% SARS-like cannot infect humans, and we know that WIV1 at 90% similarity seems as if it can at the very least infect human cells, it seems as if it would be reasonable to think that there might just not be a linear relationship in this family of viruses.
If that were the case, why didn't NIH come back to us and say, well, actually, we refute your suggestion. This was the standard thought at the time, scientifically, that the further you go away from that evolutionarily, it's the less chance that it's going to be a significant pathogen. NIH had every opportunity to review that and say, actually, we disagree. You're not going to do that experiment. We would have said, okay, can we do the alternative that's non-infectious? I'm sure that we would have gone ahead with that and got interesting results, maybe not quite as useful.
Yeah, so as I said, it's not so much about NIAID, because their eventual reasoning, I think, was not related to what I've talked about so far.
I think
so
it is about...
Wait, Dr. Daszak, my point is there are 3 or 4 different reasons in your letter. not all of them factored ultimately into NIAID's reasoning, but as a reader, when we think about grantee transparency and integrity, there's a concern that you're leaving out an awful lot of context from the letter.
I don't know how many reams of paper you wanted us to respond to. We cited references in our response. I sought the best advice in the world from Dr. Barrick, who's an author on that paper. He could have told us, wait, that's not a good paper to cite. He suggested we cite it. I mean, we did everything we could to lay out the case. NIH then had every opportunity to refuse it and say, no, do the alternative.
That's helpful. And so that sort of last argument was that Dr. Ralph Barrick's group took a WIV1 spike, put it on a SARS backbone, and showed a loss of function, not a gain of function. And I think for us, the question is, your work was going to be with a WIV1 backbone and other spikes, and so the WIV1 spike would be the only part of WIV1 that was not relevant at all for your work. And so I'm confused about that.
I think if you look at the results from that experiment, because I think we did the experiment and the results showed that there was no difference in any aspect of that information.
Yeah, my point is...
So I think our predictions were absolutely spot on. So I don't know why this should be an issue now almost 10 years later.
Well, I think it's that you haven't quite answered what I was asking about. In other words, you pointed to experiments testing the WIV1 spike, right?
In the letter to NIH.
Yeah. You were going to use the WIV1 backbone. The only part of WIV1 that you were not going to use at all is the WIV1 spike. So I think as a reader, I'm a little bit uncertain about...
Well, I'm sorry, but at this point, I'm confused over WIV1 spike, WIV16, SHC014.
Well, I think it's
there
fair
are
to say...
multiple experiments we did.
Yeah, so it's a little bit concerning that you're confused, I think, is my...
Well, because I don't have the documents in front of me. You've got a question there about it. Look, we were asked by NIH to explain why we believed this experiment would not lead to any aberrant reactions. We explained why we felt that. We were then asked to produce an alternative. We did. NIH reviewed it, and as you said, that they spent some time reviewing this detailed proposal, and then came back, I think, in July of 2016 and said, this is not covered by the gain-of-function pause. The experiment can move ahead. I think this is a system where the oversight was there. It was brought into play because we proposed that work and they saw it and said, hold on, let's check. They checked and allowed it to move forward. And for that particular experiment, there was no issue at all. And for all of the experiments we did, we submitted the results to NIH and they had no concerns whatsoever with those results. So I think this shows the system was working. Maybe there are ways we could tighten it up, and I fully support that. And EcoHealth will do everything we can to comply with any new rules you think are adequate, and I think that's a good thing.
So I think it's helpful to transition to the oversight. We've talked a little bit about the one-log rule that NIAID put on your grant. That rule, I'll just read it out. It's just one sentence. Should any of the SARS-like chimeras show evidence of enhanced growth greater than 1 log over the backbone, you've got to stop all the experiments, notify your program officer. You told us that you'd receive data from WIV and that you and your team at EcoHealth would review that to make sure everybody's in compliance with the 1-log rule, which makes sense. I think we just have a couple of questions about how that unfolded. In the year 3 report, you gave the experiment results from that year, showing what the chimeric viruses did. WIV1, the backbone, just wasn't in the report. We talked about this in November. I don't think it should be new to you. The full-length WIV1 wasn't included in.
Oh, this is the report, but then it was in the publication.
Yeah, that almost makes it worse. In other words, without...
Well, there was no significant difference between the two graphs, actually. I mean, I don't see why that's of any relevance, really.
So...
Other than the timing. I mean, clearly the results they had for WIV1 weren't ready to submit for the report, but were available when they submitted the paper. And we're all on the paper together, I believe. So that's a standard, normal thing in doing science. What you do with NIH oversight, when you submit a report, you send them everything you've got, and it's often unpublished data. It might be wrong. It might need to be analyzed further. There may be missing parts of it. So I think what you're finding is something that was missing, that then was done, and then put into the paper.
So without the backbone, you can't possibly know if you are or are not in compliance with the 1-log rule. Is that right?
No, that's not right. I mean, well, no one can know in advance for sure.
1 log above
reasonable,
what?
With reasonable hypothesis based on that evolutionary distance, based on everything we know about these viruses, we put forward the rationale for us thinking that this would not lead to a striking, significant difference. NIH approved it because they also believe that. We did the experiment, reported it back, Nobody came back to us and said this is highly concerning, because it wasn't. The results were unremarkable.
I'm sorry, because that's not even close to what I asked. So the question is, without the backbone strain, it is not possible to know whether you are or are not in compliance with the one log rule. Is that right?
I don't think that's correct.
Why not?
Well, I just don't, I'd have to look at the data, but I don't think that's correct.
Well, it's pretty easy. So the one log, we'll go back over it. The one log rule is you can't go one log above the backbone. And so if you don't know what the backbone is, how can you measure compliance?
Well, you'd have to look at the actual filing of what the proposed backbone was.
I agree, and you don't have it in your report.
So let me ask you, did that go over one log higher than the with backbone?
No, it didn't end up doing that.
So then why is this an issue at all for anybody?
Well, that's easy, I think. It's because in year 4, the subsequent year, it went way over one log.
That was a different virus.
Sure. It indicates, however,
different issue.
It indicates, however, that the subsequent year, when you did start measuring the backbone strain's performance, we went over a log. And you've talked to us about why you think it should not be used.
You're not comparing apples to apples. That's a completely different experiment. And by the way, you say it went over one log viral growth. Those were genome copies per gram. They're widely known to be inaccurate and not a very ideal measure of true viral growth. That should be a viral titer. So I think that's an unfair comparison and not relevant.
I can appreciate that.
Thanks.
What did the viral titers say?
I think you know the answer to that.
It would help, I think, folks to hear.
We never received viral titers in the end.
Did you ever ask for them?
Well, if you look at the results, you'll see that there's no significant difference in the final day of that experiment. By day 6, the number of genome copies per gram had returned to normal. There would have been no need to go back and do extra work in an experiment that was unremarkable with no significant problems.
Just because, again, we are focused on the details, which I know can be tedious, but it was day 8 that they evened out. So it was.
I think day 6 they were pretty much evened out.
I don't
statistically.
think they were.
Well, let's check.
That's fine. We can do that. And so I think the situation you were in there is the other accompanying figure shows that those mice are losing more weight than the mice that are infected with that backbone strain. And you've got one log of growth on days 2, 4, and 6. And you're telling me, well, it evened out on day 8, so it doesn't count.
Well, you seem somehow concerned about that. We submitted that report to NIH. The program officer clearly read it. NIH never once got back to us and said, look, we have concerns over that issue. If they had done, we would have said, okay, let's discuss, let's get the data, let's conduct viral titers, let's check all the raw data. Nobody reported anything because it wasn't remarkable. Those are normal variations within a small group of mice. We didn't even get to publish it because it probably wouldn't have been publishable. It just wasn't that significant. And if you look at my conclusions in the report I don't say, wow, we had this striking response from a group of mice that suggests this virus is highly dangerous. We certainly didn't say what you read out from a paper by Dr. Barrick, evidence that it's on the cusp of a pandemic. No, we said, and this experiment shows that there are sometimes different responses to different viruses and different conditions. That's it. It wasn't remarkable. It isn't a cause for concern. I also want to remind the committee, these are SARS-CoV-related bat viruses. They're not known to be infectious to people. They're nothing to do with COVID-19. They're not related to SARS-CoV-2. So again, going back to reporting of an experiment almost 10 years ago and sort of saying, well, we need to go back and get more information. That won't be possible. No one asked for it at the time. We showed the results, all the results we had to NIH, and they were unremarkable, and NIH clearly agreed. They then awarded the next year's funding, and we continued our work.
Yeah, and I think you've helpfully said that even if that year 4 is viewed as going over one log, it's the same experiment as year 5. It's one single experiment. I think that's your testimony, right?
Yes, that's right. That's my understanding.
And I think, as the majority alluded to, we're a little bit unsure about that, but just some data points on it. The year 5 report says, in year 5, we continued with in vivo experiments. Just as a starting point, does that not sound to you like in year 5 they continued with experiments?
Look, this is the language received from Chinese nationals writing in English. Our understanding of that was they continued analyzing from their in vivo experiments, which is what's in the report. It's the pathology from the experiment.
So it's an English proficiency problem?
It's your misinterpretation of what they meant problem. My interpretation is that, which I think is shown by the data, that they were doing the pathology on an experiment that was concluded a year ago, which is normal.
Yeah, so those two experiments,
Absolutely normal.
those two experiments are also measured over different time spans. The figure in year 4 is 6 days. The figure in year 5 is 14 days. That sounds like a different experiment.
Well, we were told it isn't a different experiment, it's the same experiment. And unfortunately, it's going to be very difficult to get any information on that now. I did try, but we were told it's the same experiment.
Yeah.
Now, the time difference may be easily explained by the way they set up the experiment. Maybe some of those mice were allowed to live longer before they were terminated, killed.
Maybe, and so that
Yeah,
helps.
I mean, that's totally reasonable.
Well, I don't quite agree there, but I suppose you can say maybe. We asked what your source was for it being a single experiment. Am I right that the source for that is the Wuhan Institute of Virology told you so?
The source is the lab that did the experiment.
That's what they told
That's
you.
the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
And that was after the pandemic when they told you that?
It was when I asked, when I was asked to ask by NIH.
Was that
I did
after
what I
the
was-
pandemic?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. After it had begun, yeah.
Do you think there's any possibility that they might have been incentivized to be less than truthful with you in that situation?
I'm not going to comment on people's motives that I don't know. I've had a long relationship with the scientists in that lab. I've told you about that. You get to understand people and you get to know them. And, you hear the same stories over 20 years. You hear if there are any discrepancies in their stories. They've always been honest with us. They've always been truthful. There's never been any untoward, underhand things going on. I have no reason to think that they were under pressure to lie. There was no indication of that. They've not lied about other things, to my knowledge. These are good scientists that are trying to do their job, and they're some of the best scientists in the world.
Okay. I'll yield some time back, but I think the broader theme throughout that is a little bit of a concern that when you discuss your work, either here at the Select Subcommittee or with regulators or in public-facing situations, it's possible, perhaps, that you're framing issues in the way that is most favorable to you and less so in a way that's confronting the science at any given moment. And that is just a concern.
I've only told you the truth.